Hey, and welcome back. In this episode, we are going to cover a little bit more in depth what the concept of middleware is and a little bit about building your own middleware using the express use method. So we've already seen middleware in a couple places. This is a different example than what we've been using, but if you recall, if I needed to set up the ability to retrieve a requester's body, the object that they're sending to me, I'd have to tell my server to .use express.json. So app.use is a way for us to build our own middleware because we can give it different arguments and different things to do on the in-between. But it doesn't end the server process, right? As soon as this is done, it keeps reading down until it hits a res.send. So if we had to define middleware broadly, even if you go to the Express docs and read, they state that Express is basically just a handful of middleware all firing, when appropriate. All the routes we wrote in previous lessons, not all of those get triggered every time we make a request. It's just the one that's supposed to. So in that case, it's a middleware. Well, just like express.json, we can write middlewares to do all sorts of tasks for us on the in-between. So we need to talk about the anatomy a little bit of how it's built. Well, we always use app.use. And app.use takes two arguments, possibly two arguments. So the first one I'm going to say here is optional. Optional because, as we saw with express.json, we didn't use this one. And what this is the mount path, also known as, for us, the endpoint. So we can say app.use when you get a request to / something, do the following. Or we leave it out, and now it's going to fire on every request. Great. The second argument is a callback function, and it receives the request and response objects. In addition, it receives a function called next. So it receives the request and response objects, also the next function. The reason why this next function exists and why we're given it is because middleware typically, not typically, doesn't always end the server process, right? So in the case of express.json, this isn't the end of the road. We still need it to keep reading down more to finish its operation. So if the middleware we're writing isn't the end of the line, we can call next, and that just tells Express to go look for the next piece of middleware to run. If it's this runs first and next is called, the next thing it would maybe hit is the route, and then goes and triggers one of those. So the next function, simply put, moves on to the next middleware in line. Great. All right, so let's build our own middleware and see how this works. It's very useful. We'll be using it later in this course for error handling. So in my server.js here, I'm just going to write some middleware functions. We're not worried about routes or any of the things we've learned so far. This is just a side note. So I'm going to say app.use. When you get a request to items, receive the request and the response objects, and also the next function. So we're used to rec and res, but now we're adding next. And in fact, every route we've written so far also has access to this, which we will be using later in the course. Now, the rec and res object we see here are the ones coming in from the client and the one that we have to send back. But let's say we're not ready to send back. So we're just going to console.log the items middleware was executed. And then we're going to call next. And let's just see what happens with that. We'll start up the server here and go ahead and make a get request and see what happens if the endpoint is items. Now, since we're saying use, this is going to trigger on any type of request to / items, get, post, put, delete, or otherwise. We'll just be testing it with get. So we come here to get items, we'll send. It says cannot get items because we didn't send anything back. But if we come down to our console here in the server, there is our console log. The items middleware was executed. And what happened was next was called, and so our server kept running, but notice there's no more code and sent back this response saying cannot get to items. So let's build that endpoint. Let's make an app.get endpoint here to / items with a request, response, and next being passed in. And let's console.log get request received. And res.send just a message, hello world. Right, if we're reading this from top to bottom, what we should expect to have happened is our get request will come in, express.json will fire, it won't see a rec body, it'll keep coming down, it'll see our endpoint items and trigger this middleware. It should console log and call next, which will just call the next function in line, so it moves down. It sees that this get request matches the endpoint and the method that we're requesting through, so this should get console logged, and then we should receive this in Postman. So let's try that out. Now when we send a get, we get back the hello world. Great, so really simple example, but we wrote our own little middleware function that console logs something, and next triggers literally the next thing in line, the next thing that can be triggered. And as long as we res.send, our server will end its session as usual. Now this is a good time to talk about it. Every single middleware, everything we write in Express needs to either call next or send a response and end the process. Because otherwise, as you'll see when we first started this lesson, your server doesn't find anything that corresponds, it doesn't send a response, so in its place it sends a 404 not found message. All right, let's prove one more point with this middleware here. So I'm going to make one more app.use to items. And the point that I want to prove here is that, well, let me phrase this as a question. Is this request, and this request all the same thing? And the answer should be yes if the request is to /items, because all of this is happening during the same request. This is firing, then next, this is firing, and we'll call next, and then this is firing. So each time the middleware fires, it's receiving the request and response objects for that individual request, so all of these are the same thing. So what we're going to do in the second route is we're going to add something to the request, and that's what we're going to send here. So I'm going to say rec.body. Since we're not sending one, I'll just make one here. I'll say rec.body is an object with a name set to Rick. And then in this route, I'm going to res.send rec.body. So we receive it here without a request body, we add that to the request here, and then we're sending it here to prove the fact that these are all the same thing. All right, let's test it out. And oh no, what did I do? You might have spotted it, but let's go look at it anyways. This isn't a hard one because look, there's no error. Our server wasn't responding and there wasn't an error. So what could have caused this from this happening? I hit send and it just sits here. Yeah, you may be screaming it here. I've said we'd do it and I forgot to do it. We did not play next. So it hit this, it called next, it created the rec.body, and then it just sat here eternally till the server timed out. So now this should work as expected. So one more time. There we go. Name Rick. Okay, so the this is just for practice, so give you a better idea of what middleware is, what tools you have available to you. Remember, I could remove the endpoint from this, and now every single request that comes through will grab the rec.body and overwrite it with this object. So this would be bad in a real application, but notice it still works. It's still firing on the request of /items because I left off the initial path. So have some practice with this just to better conceptualize what middleware really is, and then let's move on.